Hello and welcome to the seventh episode of the Connect the Dots NYC podcast. I'm your host, Vedant Vohra, and I am so excited to take you on this journey as we explore different solutions to homelessness. As a creator of the CTD NYC app, I've seen how technology can connect people to vital resources. CTD NYC helps individuals experiencing homelessness in New York City access shelters, food, and healthcare, bridging the gap between them and essential services. It's a powerful example of innovation meeting compassion to tackle the homelessness crisis. Each episode will dive into stories, strategies, and innovations from those on the front lines, whether they're advocates, policymakers, service providers, or individuals with lived experiences. My goal is to spark meaningful conversations and shine a light on the incredible work being done to make housing more accessible for everyone. Thanks for joining me today, and let's get started. Today's guest is Adina Lichtman. Adina Lichtman is a social impact entrepreneur, author, and changemaker who's redefining grassroots activism for today's world. She's the founder of Knock Knock Give a Sock, a nonprofit she launched from her college dorm that has since become a national movement. KKGS, or Knock Knock Give a Sock, goes beyond collecting socks for people experiencing homelessness. It builds community through conversation and connection between housed and unhoused individuals. What began as a simple act of kindness, giving socks to someone who noted they were rarely donated, grew into a mission to combat stigma and foster empathy. Under Adina's leadership, KKGS has distributed hundreds of thousands of socks and created initiatives like Meet Your Neighbor dinners, which brings people from shelters and local businesses together for shared meals and dialogue. She's also the founder of Our Hand Project, a visual storytelling effort connecting youth with Holocaust survivors to preserve living memory. With a background in social work and fine arts from NYU, Adina brings heart, skill, and vision to every project, grounded in unwavering belief in the power of human connection. Welcome, Adina.
Wow. Thank you so much. That was a great introduction. Definitely send me that intro. Sounds great. You definitely did your homework. Pleasure to be here. How are you doing?
I'm doing amazing. But I want to start at the beginning of this whole journey. How did Knock Knock Give a Sock come to life? And what was it about that first interaction that really stayed with you?
So a whole bunch of years ago, I was a sophomore in college in New York City, and I was giving out sandwiches to some of my neighbors on the street. And one man said, "Ma'am, it's so nice you're giving out sandwiches, but one thing we could really use are a pair of socks." And I very quickly realized my pink polka dotted socks weren't going to fit my new friend Diego. So I decided to knock on every door on my floor. And in about 15 minutes, I got over 40 pairs of socks. By the time I was a senior in college, we spread to over 20 college campuses and collected over 50,000 pairs of socks, which is when I joked that I became a bit of a sock celebrity on campus. And I'd be asked to speak to different synagogues, churches, college classrooms about the work that I was doing. And when I went, I would go in and I had a very specific message. My message was all about how it's so important that when we're helping different communities, right here I was giving out sandwiches, thinking sandwiches were what the community needed, but then learning that socks were actually the most needed item. And what I learned in that moment is when it comes to helping communities to ask what they need as opposed to assuming what they need. And so that was a big part of my work. And that was a big part of the conversations that I would have when I would speak to different communities, synagogues, churches. But when I was talking to these audiences, I would also ask them a second question. Or rather, not a second question. I would ask them these two questions. I'd say, raise your hand if you've ever given money, food, or clothing to someone in need. And almost everyone could raise their hand. And then I would say, raise your hand if you could tell me the name of one person who's experienced homelessness. And often in those rooms, almost no one could raise their hand. And I realized there was a massive disconnect between communities of people that we were helping and those people actually knowing the people who are affected by homelessness. So while my original message, and it's still an important message, started in making sure we're asking our neighbors what they need as opposed to assuming, I also realized that there was another problem, a massive disconnect between communities who give and communities who receive. And when I was thinking about social movements across America, when I was thinking about the Black Lives Matter movement, when I was thinking about the LGBTQ plus movement, when I was thinking about people who've been affected by cancer and different diseases, right? People give back to organizations that either they are personally affected by or know people who are personally affected by, right? In corporate America, so many people know people who've been affected by cancer, right? So many people know people who are part of these different minorities, or they themselves are a part of these minorities. But when you ask the question, corporate America, who here can tell you the name of someone experiencing homelessness? And almost no one could raise their hand. How do you expect change? Social change happens. Donations happen when people feel connected to the people who are affected by these different causes. That's why, in the homelessness space, so many people go and volunteer for a day at a soup kitchen and they feel good about it. And then they leave, but it doesn't become the problem that they rally around. And I wanted to change that. That's when I wanted to bring, after I had been asking these questions, that's when I wanted to bring 50 of my college classmates and 50 of my neighbors who experienced homelessness, right? The people who donated socks and the people who received socks, to have dinner side by side, to create a meet your neighbor dinner where nobody was allowed to serve anybody. And it was at this dinner that we created, a college student said, Adina, we can't tell who's living in a shelter and who's our college classmate. And connections were formed and people felt seen and people cared about homelessness in a different way after leaving that event. And that's when Knock Knock Give a Sock's mission became to humanize homelessness one sock at a time by turning transactions, the donations of socks, into interactions, into meet your neighbor dinners. And that's when I really wanted this organization to have a fundamental shift in not just being about donating socks, but about turning transactions into interactions.
And KKGS isn't just about giving socks. Like you mentioned, it's about building bridges between communities. And so, can you explain how the model works and why connection is at the center of it?
So the model itself is all about engaging different communities, whether it's a synagogue, a church, a college classroom, a JP Morgan, a Blackstone, a different company, right? It's really about getting our quote unquote sock in the door, getting companies to donate socks, and then afterwards turn that transaction into an interaction, right? Bring their employees, bring their communities to have dinner side by side with people experiencing homelessness, because I really feel that is where change happens, right? That is where social change happens, right? Transactions are great, but it's not social change. It's not a social movement. When people feel passionate about these different causes, that's when you create change. And that's what I want to create. I say, I want to make homelessness personal. And it's personal when you know somebody who's been personally affected by homelessness.
And can you walk us through these meet your neighbor dinners that you touched on earlier? What makes those moments so impactful and so different from traditional charity?
So the meet your neighbor dinners, what makes the dinner most unique is there's no volunteer-volunteer dynamic. We don't call anybody volunteers at the event. We have a dinner where, let's say, 25 of our neighbors from shelters have dinner with 25 people working in a corporate office. And what happens at this dinner is everybody comes in with one rule, two rules. No one's allowed to serve food to anybody else. And the other rule is everybody has to sit next to one new person. And they come in, everybody's, trying to find a place where there's an empty seat so someone new can come and sit with them. Every table has icebreaker questions on it, like what was your favorite food growing up and who made it for you? Does God play a role in your life? If so, how? What does your perfect day look like? And people are coming and answering these questions that aren't about why are you homeless? How did you end up living in a shelter, right? They're questions about connecting human beings. And what ends up happening is people walk away feeling humbled and inspired. And I believe that there's something that happens intrinsically. People coming from shelters, they come in and they tell their stories to social workers, to caseworkers, to different people who are working to try and get them out of the shelter system. And it's the same story that they hear over and over again. But when you talk to a JP Morgan executive about how you were struggling to put food on your child's table and how getting a job after incarceration is actually extremely difficult, even if you have a college degree, all of a sudden your story is given such validation and such weight and really inspires the people coming from the corporate world to say, wow, I can't believe you show up every single day despite the odds that you faced, right? Here's the person coming from the corporate world with their stress. We all have stresses, right? But how inspiring, right? I always say, it's more like we turn the people who are coming from shelters into the volunteers, into the folks who are inspiring the people who are coming from homes every day, showing how they show up every single day. And we have people who come to our Meet Your Neighbor dinners from the shelters who will get up and share their stories. And I've had people who've gotten up and said, in society, I feel like I'm a burden to society. I feel like I'm annoying to society. But here at these Meet Your Neighbor dinners, I feel a part of society. I had someone who came over to me who said, Adina, I've been living in Brooklyn my entire life. I spent over 10 years in prison. Said, I've never seen my Brooklyn look like this. Black people and white people sitting together. This is my first time sitting at the same table as a white person. So what we're doing to change spaces, and we're changing spaces on both sides, from people coming from homes and people coming from shelters. And there's a piece of my work that I think just bringing people from different cultures and different walks of life makes both communities walk away feeling inspired and humbled, right? You go volunteer at a soup kitchen, right? You even bring your 12-year-old kid to come volunteer at a soup kitchen, and the parents feel amazing. The kids feel amazing. They feel like they're the best people in the world. And don't get me wrong, they're great people for doing that and spending their Sundays like that. But the person who comes from the shelter, it's where they're getting their food. Their situation isn't being changed at all. When you bring two people to come and share and both be vulnerable, you're creating dignity in a way that doesn't exist in most other places.
And what's a story from KKGS that reminds you why you do this work?
There are so many. There's so many. But my favorite is one time we did a Meet Your Neighbor dinner in Atlanta. And a year later, the company asked us, come back to Atlanta. We want to do another Meet Your Neighbor dinner. And one of the women who worked at that law firm got up and she said, it's been such a pleasure working with Knock Knock Give a Sock. There were two guys who came to the Meet Your Neighbor dinner that I met last year, who came for Thanksgiving dinner, who've been coming to my son's football games. And it's changed our family. That's probably one of my favorite stories. It's about making people feel included. I think a major gap in people's understanding of homelessness is loneliness. Like, I think a lot of people, what's the leading cause of homelessness? People will say lack of affordable housing. People will say lack of mental health resources, all of these different things. But I really think the difference between someone who's experiencing homelessness and not is just about people having networks, resources, community that can help. That's the difference. And so many people who are living in homeless shelters do not have the family, do not have the community that can support them in the way they need.
And do you believe that that concept of loneliness is a fairly big misconception that people have about homelessness? And if so, how does KKGS try to break that down?
I think loneliness is a major element of homelessness. I speak to a lot of audiences and I ask them, who here knows somebody who's ever been in between jobs? Who knows anybody who's had a mental health issue? Who knows anybody and by the way, when we talk about mental health issues, we could be talking about something as simple as anxiety or depression and being able to go to a psychiatrist to get medication, right? Who here knows anybody who's had a learning disability? Who here knows somebody who's been a parent? Who here knows anybody who has been incarcerated? I talk to tons of communities. Hands are raised for every single question. The difference is having resources and having people who can help you in those situations. Right? If moving back home just makes you another mouth to feed and your family can't afford that, you're going to the shelter system, right? You don't have a place to go. So now, how does Knock Knock Give a Sock address that? The truth is, Knock Knock Give a Sock doesn't address that. Knock Knock Give a Sock, our mission is not to end homelessness. We want homelessness to be ended, but our mission is not to end homelessness. Our mission is to humanize homelessness and make people care about homelessness. Let this be an issue that people rally about. Because as I said in the beginning, social change happens when people care about the social issue. When people care about the social issues that they feel most affected by. There's a hierarchy in terms of what people care about, right? First, they care about their family. Then they care about their jobs. Then they care about their communities, their friends, their social circles. Then they care about their hobbies and interests outside of that. Then afterwards, there might be space for the causes that they care about and that they're passionate about. And that also has a hierarchy. So you're going to care most about the issues that most closely affect people that you know, right? So if people who have resources, right? We're already talking about number 5 when it comes to philanthropy and charity. And then you have to think about what charities they care the most about. So if you're working in the homelessness space, you are competing against a lot. So how do we create social change? I believe we create social change when we make social issues personal. And how do you do that? By creating connection. And that's where I feel like the biggest change happens. And on a day-to-day level, people experiencing homelessness who are living in shelters get to get out of the shelter, connect with people who are outside of their community, outside of their immediate struggles that they're all experiencing together one-on-one. And, there are occasionally benefits where someone will get a job, where someone will, make a connection where they are meeting up with someone consistently for cups of coffee, or they were able to help buy their kid a Christmas present, right? There are those transactional benefits, but the real focus of my job is actually not even keeping tabs on all of those interactions, but really how many people can we engage in sitting down side by side with our neighbors who've experienced homelessness? How many people can we make homelessness their cause that they champion around?
And you've worked closely with shelters, service providers, and people experiencing homelessness. And so, in your view, what's missing most from the conversations around housing insecurity?
Gosh, where do we start? Job opportunities, lack of affordable housing. The list goes on and on. So what Knock Knock Give a Sock focuses is a little bit different because there's so many organizations that are focusing on the most pressing issues. But I honestly believe that our work goes hand in hand with what needs the most change, right? If there's a housing project or a shelter that's going to go up in certain communities, and I've gotten these calls. Hey, the community is rallying against having a shelter be put on their block. They don't feel it's safe, right? We're talking about like vocational job shelters, right? Where most of the people are working. I've gotten calls saying there are people who are rallying against it, community boards. And so now all of a sudden housing facilities aren't going up because of the stigmas and stereotypes around homelessness. And that's where we try to step in. That's where we try to create change. And unfortunately, more often than not, we're too late. When I've gotten those calls, I'm like, yes, let's do it. Let's make it happen. And those communities are already suing the city for even proposing the idea.
I now want to turn and focus a little bit more on the entrepreneurship aspect of your life. You made the nonprofit Knock Knock Give a Sock, and you've done so much in terms of creating a community for the unhoused community, specifically in New York City. And so my question is that you call yourself, an optimistic entrepreneur. And so I want to ask you, what does that mean in practice, especially in this field where the challenges are heavy and slow to change, as you described?
I think the biggest thing is you just need to know that you're always swimming against the current. It doesn't get easier. You might be farther along. You might be closer to the goal. So it doesn't seem as daunting, but you're always swimming against the current. And 9 out of 10 calls, right? I'm trying to get different communities to engage in these dinners, different corporate offices. 9 out of 10 emails, calls are going to go unanswered, right? You're kind of a little bit in the sales business when it comes to social change. And also getting creative. Oh, so you don't want to do Meet Your Neighbor dinner? What if we bring in someone who's experienced homelessness to tell their story while your office pack just sucks, right? Kind of figuring out how you can work with different places and spaces to let them hear you out. Yes, so the concept of optimistic entrepreneurship is really, you're just going to get a ton of no's. And, there are some days where I just like throw my hands up and I'm like, what is going on? But most days it's like, all right, kind of like Dory from Finding Nemo, just keep swimming, just keep swimming. It's a big part of the job. And I think the biggest thing is learning how to remove the ego and also balance the ego. One, removing the ego is someone says no once, email them every year. They're not going to answer you half the time, but just because you get a no, you take the no as not now. Keep coming back. You keep showing up. That's one thing, right? And that's how you have to remove the ego. There's also, we're living in a time and place where people want to know founders. People want to know the companies. Companies can't have their founders anymore hiding behind the company or the brand. So with that, balancing the ego and putting yourself in front of the camera, right? Even you here, right? We're on a podcast talking about homelessness and you're like, tell me about your entrepreneurship journey. Humans are curious. They're interested in people. So getting real and vulnerable and sharing that part, I think, is one of the most important aspects.
And going back to that young college dorm self, that young founder who's building KKGS, what were some of the biggest obstacles you faced, and how did you go through them?
I think there were two. I think the first time that I wanted to do a Meet Your Neighbor dinner, I was going to different groups. One, the first Meet Your Neighbor dinner that I wanted to create, I remember speaking to a certain institute on campus that focused on poverty. And I told them about my idea, wanting to create a Meet Your Neighbor dinner on campus, wanting to work with them. They basically sent me back an email saying, what you're doing is exploiting people who are experiencing homelessness, having them sit with college students. And I worked hard to get that meeting. I knocked on their doors every day. I finally got a meeting with someone pretty low on the totem pole who didn't even email me back afterwards. And then I had to email her and she basically told me sorry, the higher ups think this is an exploitive idea. So I was like, shit, if they're saying and they're the experts, I must not be able to do this. There must be something intrinsically wrong. Except that I'm really proud of myself that I actually spoke to people from shelters. I spoke to shelter directors. I spoke to people who lived in shelters. And the theme was the same again and again. They're like, wait, your group and our group are going to sit together side by side with dignity? That sounds great. So many people come in and they just serve them food. That is more of a hierarchy. That is more exploitive. Let me serve you because you can't serve yourself, right? So that was one of the hardest moments, but probably the most eye-opening moment and a real lesson in terms of feedback is important. Criticism is important, but filtration is important too. Understanding what you're doing, why you're doing, not just taking one person or one institution's advice and going with it, but really asking the people who are most affected, right? Between you and me, having a bunch of white privileged people who are sitting in an office saying this is exploitation without talking to the people who've experienced homelessness, there's a disconnect, right? So shame on that institution for not thinking about that, right? Without asking, without talking to the community. The second thing is, I think I'd been doing it for a couple of years and I was like, I don't know how I'm ever going to bring in any money. And then there's one grant on campus for $10,000. And I was like, you know what? This will be my my North Star. If I get the grant, I got to keep doing Knock Knock Give a Sock. If I don't, I gotta pull the plug. It's clearly not going to be like, it's not, it's not worth it. And I didn't get the grant, and I cried for hours. And I remember saying, like, I just can't do it anymore. Like, that's myself. Like, I can't, like, that's got to close up shop. And I think I was crying harder about not getting the grant, but about having to close up Knock Knock Give a Sock. And I remember I came home, and like, I was like a mess with my parents. They were like, well, like, like, you set up this rule that you have to end it if you don't get this grant. I remember I told my co-founder at the time, like, I was like, that was my thinking, that I'm just going to end. And he's like, what? Like, what is even that thought process? Maybe that was my first lesson in terms of like, you either choose to do it full on or you don't, but don't put outside factors as your determining factors. And listen, like, once I dove into it full time, and for a long time I was in school, and I kept telling people, I think I'm going to do this full time after school. I don't know. And I remember my dad said, he's like, you don't have to do it, but like, make a decision. Like, you're either doing it or you're not. Like, your toes in the water, either jump in or walk away. That was probably the best advice that I'd ever gotten.
And has your vision changed as Knock Knock Give a Sock has grown? And what does long-term impact look like to you now?
I think it has grown in the sense of what we do. Like, our mission is to humanize homelessness by turning transactions into interactions, right? These sock donations into Meet Your Neighbor events. But today we have 4 pillars of our organization. Pillar number 1 is sock drives, and actually our Sockcess job program, where we hire people living in local homeless shelters to help us distribute our socks, as well as a bunch of other jobs that we have. The second pillar are our Meet Your Neighbor lunches and dinners. The third pillar of our organization is education advocacy, right? So that's like when we'll go to an office and do a lunch and learn, where someone will share their journey and story around homelessness, and then they'll package up socks. We also have written children's books on homelessness to help educate families on homelessness, as well as doing 2 major community events a year, which one is called our Woodsock Night of the Arts, where we bring artists who've experienced homelessness to share their stories through storytelling, music, poetry, visual arts. We also have a winter event every year for over 500 kids living in local homeless shelters, where we have kids living in shelters who come to our carnival with over 25 booths, backpacks filled with gifts, Santa gift giveaways, you name it, we have it. So that's like all the programming that we do. So it's definitely expanded beyond just the sock drives and the Meet Your Neighbor events. So I'd say, yes, we've definitely grown. And long term, in an ideal world, right now we're programming mostly in New York City, but an ideal world would be to have a program director in different cities across America working on these different initiatives.
And now I want to move beyond Knock Knock Give a Sock, just like your general legacy and how you've been in terms of advocacy and all of the initiatives you founded. And so you also founded the Our Hand Project, which connects youth to Holocaust survivors. And so what drew you to that work, and how does that align with your larger mission in life?
So it's actually interesting. So that work is not as big of a focus in my life, while as Holocaust work in general actually is. It's more on like a personal front. I have a 1.5-year-old, and he's already met 5 Holocaust survivors, and taken pictures with them to make sure that their stories are remembered, even though he can't remember the stories right now, making sure that when he grows up, he'll know that he met those Holocaust survivors that we tell him stories about. And that's really the most important thing, so that people don't get disconnected from it. That comes from a passion project of myself being a grandchild of Holocaust survivors. My grandmother was in Auschwitz. My grandfather spent years being, in the prisoner of war in Siberia, being shipped from Poland to Siberia. So I think that is a big part of my identity. I also think it's important for people's work to not become their entire identity, right? So while the Holocaust is a super big passion of mine, homelessness is a super big passion of mine. Me and my husband, we host Shabbat dinners every week at our house and have 8 to 10 people over every week, making sure that your life is full. I think a lot of founders out there and entrepreneurs and startups there's this like hustle grind culture. I just read an article on Mr. Beast, um, and people are like, this kid, he's so successful, but it's not, he's 26 years old, but he started at 13 and he worked on Thanksgiving and he worked on Christmas. And that's amazing for him. But to me, one of the most important things in life is balance. And when I mean balance, I mean a focus on the relationships in your life. I think if you can focus on healthy relationships in your life and feel balanced in them, it'll give you the stability to really achieve the dreams that you want to accomplish.
And so you have these two major parts of your identity, homelessness and Holocaust memory, and your work in both of them centers around storytelling. And so why
Mhm.
do you believe stories are so powerful in terms of tools for change?
I think people are very curious. I think people are interested in human interest pieces. Um, I think, my husband always talks about it. When it comes to politics and politicians, he says no one knows about policies. Everybody knows their personalities. Everybody knows their talking points, but no one knows their policies. Um, I think to create change is rooted in people listening, and people are interested in people's stories. And that's where I think storytelling is huge.
And so not everyone is going to start a nonprofit. We're not all as impressive as you
And
are.
I
And
don't think everyone should because, there won't be enough funding to go around.
exactly. So what can the rest of us do as neighbors, students, employees, whatever occupation we may have to be a part of the solution?
I think find your cause and find ways to get involved. At my desk at home, I have a piece of paper that says, it has like a few questions. And one of them is, what did you do to make someone's day better today? And thinking about that and setting aside time for the causes that you care about. It's easy to think, but it's hard to put on action. Um, so whether it's putting on your calendar, but just action. I think people stay in the thinking process too long. I want to do something. You can do something. Literally, go.
And on that same note, what advice would you give to a young listener, old listener, any listener really, who has an idea but doubts their ability to make a difference?
It starts with one. Everybody can make a difference for one person, right? If you can't change homelessness, you know what you can do? Buy on the street corner that guy a meal. If you can't do that, learn his name. Think people, and again, I spoke about ego earlier. Making a difference is very rooted in ego. Everyone can make a difference. Can everyone make the biggest difference in the world? Can everyone start a nonprofit, change a community, build a platform? No. Everybody can make change. The more personal change you can make, probably the better. But people get very stuck on ego. You know, how did I make a change? I talk to people in corporate America all the time, and they're like, "Oh, you're gonna be so embarrassed, like what I do after hearing what you do." They're like, "I just work at a bank," and I'm like, "It's great. You have a hell of a lot more money than I can give, so you could start there, right?" Everybody can make change. A lot of people are just blocked by either their ego. So if it's not a big enough change, they feel defeated, right? Who says you need to make a massive change? And who says that having a conversation with one guy on the street corner isn't a bigger difference than $5,000 donated to a nonprofit?
And in all your work, what's something you've learned about people that continues to surprise or inspire you?
Um, I think the biggest thing is just people's stories, like how often I hear of different stories of why people have experienced homelessness. So many times it's health issues, right? It's gotten to a fight at work and then got fired and couldn't get a job afterwards, right? So many different things. And I think the biggest takeaway is this is like the thing that I talk about all the time, but growing up in a more privileged community, there were a couple kids who, like, still in their 30s, live with their parents, never really were able to hold a steady job, but, could work at the local Chinese place, had the stability of their family supporting them, even if they were struggling with some mental health stuff, right? But if that person didn't have the resources that they grew up with, they'd be coming to our Meet Your Neighbor dinners. And we all know those people.
And I want to end by looking forward. What gives you hope about the future of housing justice, youth led change, or social entrepreneurship in general?
My answer is going to be political, but to create change, we have to become less and less reliant on government and more reliant on nonprofits. And I hope more and more people will open their eyes to that and will be inspired.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time, your invaluable advice, and just overall sharing your experience.
Thank you. And I'm excited to keep tracking and see where you go in the future because you've already done a lot.
Thank you so much.
Take